Our third speaker is Dr. Ed Franklin, and he will discuss the practical approaches to accelerating chiral chromatography screening and method development. Go ahead, please.
Okay, well, thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. As just said, I will be talking about high throughput chiral screening using HPLC and SFC. So this kind of would precede anything that Paul just got done talking about. So identifying column chemistries that could be useful for what you actually want to take it on to, whether it's going to be a routine analytical method or whether it's ultimately with an eye towards scale up, as he talked about. So here, we're kind of looking at a general schematic approach to what chiral method development looks like at a very simple level. And really, once we've selected a mode of chromatography, the first step is going to be to choose a column. And for anybody who's done chiral chromatography work, they're likely to acknowledge that it's extremely difficult to predict before doing anything what chiral stationary phase and mobile phase combination is going to work to resolve our enantiomers of interest. So it is often necessary to screen a number of columns in a number of different mobile phase conditions to find something that's going to work that we can take on for ultimate optimization and perhaps some scale-up studies. So for that reason, the screening step, this first step, it can really benefit from some technologies that facilitate some faster and higher throughput. One of the ways, of course, to speed up screening runs is to use shorter columns that are packed with small particles and to run them at faster mobile phase linear velocities. So the benefits of small particles are pretty well known at this point. Smaller particles, they result in higher column efficiencies. They also allow us to run at faster mobile phase linear velocities without sacrificing much column efficiency. The drawback, of course, is going to be the higher operating pressure that is required to run those columns. So there are some implications there. Is your instrument even capable of supplying the pressure? But then there are some follow-up questions, of course, that need to be asked. On the bottom right-hand side of the slide, I have listed the flow and pressure specifications for the Shimadzu Nexera SFC pump. This is an instrument that we use in our lab for SFC chiral screening. So you'll see there that up to 3 mils per minute, that pump is capable of supplying a maximum pressure of about 9,800 PSI. But once we get above 3 mils per minute, up to the system maximum of 5 mils per minute, the maximum pressure drops to only about 6,400 PSI. So that could lead to an issue for reaching our desired mobile phase linear velocities if we're using relatively large ID columns that require higher flow rates. With that said, it might be tempting to say something like, well, we'll just use smaller ID columns, say 2.1 millimeter ID, in order to achieve the linear velocities that we want, but also to keep our volumetric flow rates sufficiently low so that we don't have to worry about approaching our system's maximum pressure at those higher flow rates. But if we take that approach, there is going to be a competing concern, and that is due to the extra column volume variance contribution of the instrument itself that arises from all sorts of processes in the instrument. So the injection process itself, if we've got a lot of pre and post column connecting tubing, the detector cell volume, all of these things contribute extra volume, which can smear out any resolution between our peaks, and we might miss a potential chemistry that we could take on for further method development. So our observed resolution values are going to be more affected by extra column volume. Larger columns are going to be less affected, but those will require those higher flow rates, which I just talked about on the previous slide, which could create a problem for us. So all of this kind of goes to suggest that 3 millimeter ID columns, they strike a nice balance between mitigating our extra column volume effects, but also keeping our volumetric flow rates sufficiently low. So we wanted to compare the advantages of small particles over somewhat larger particles. And to do this, we compared screening runs for 35 different compounds on 2 different columns. Both of those columns had immobilized amylose 3,5-dimethylphenylcarbamate selectors. One of the columns, it's the Reflect I amylose A column. That was a 5 centimeter long column, 3 millimeter ID, packed with 3 micron particles, while the Chiral Pack IA column had the same chemistry, same length ID, but it was packed with 1.6 micron particles. So We ran all 35 of those compounds in two different isocratic mobile phases, 80-20 hexane ethanol, 80-20 hexane IPA. And before we did any of those comparisons, we actually compared the performance of those two columns. So here you can see that we were only getting about 20% higher efficiency with that small particle column, which is much less than theory would predict. But this was the column straight out of the box, so we went ahead and performed these comparisons, expecting that that efficiency difference to translate to approximately 10% higher efficiencies when we did our comparisons. So those results are summarized here. That 3 micron column gave us a total of 33 hits, but no resolution at all for two compounds, ketamine and mepivacaine. And it was the same story qualitatively for the 1.6 micron column. So again, 33 total hits, no resolution of the same two compounds. When we dig into the data a little bit and think a little bit more quantitatively, we see that in 80-20 hexane ethanol, hexane ethanol, there were 15 instances where the resolution was at least 10% higher with that 1.6 micron column. And in 80-20 hexane IPA, there were 21 instances where the resolution was at least 10% higher, but also 8 instances where the resolution was actually higher with the 3 micron column. So we also did comparisons in gradient mode. We're emphasizing the high throughput aspect here. So we use a fairly aggressive 1.5 minute gradient from 5 to 55% alcohol. Again, this is just to help us to identify column chemistries that we can then take on for further method development. So overall with these gradient runs, there were 12 compounds for which the resolution was at least 10% higher with the 1.6 micron column, but 9 compounds for which the resolution was at least 10% higher with the larger 3 micron column. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense from a kinetic standpoint. Theoretically, we would never predict a larger particle to outperform a smaller particle. But I think we find an explanation when we construct another set of performance curves for these two columns after they had both seen some use. So at this point, after both columns had seen about 150 or so injections, the performance, at least in terms of efficiency, is actually quite similar between the 3 micron and the 1.6 micron columns. So it seems likely that the high pressure cycling that we were using, especially during those gradient runs with the 1.6 micron column, resulted in some shifting of the packed bed for that 1.6 micron column and some ultimately deteriorated performance. Now, we also did comparisons in SFC mode, the advantages of SFC. Paul talked about them in the previous talk. So in this case, we used a different 1.6 micron column, not the one that had seen the deteriorated performance in HPLC. But in this case, the new column actually gave us about 70% higher efficiency than the 3 micron column. So this is much closer to what theory would predict, although not quite exactly as much improvement. But this 70% higher efficiency should translate to about a 30% higher resolution value. So our initial gradient screening runs were 5 to 55% alcohol. Again, we were using methanol or IPA. And we were using 1 minute gradients at 1.5 mils per minute. So overall, there were 8 compounds that had at least 20% higher resolution with that 1.6 micron column than they did for the 3 micron column. And there was 1 compound that had 20% better resolution on the larger particle size. This is actually a lot more in line with what we might be expecting in this particle size comparison. But of course, one of the primary benefits of SFC is that use of low viscosity solvents, which does allow you the ability to run even faster for faster analyses. So we did the comparisons at 3 mils per minute, again with a 5 to 55% methanol, and we compared those results to what we collected at 1.5 mils per minute. So with the faster flow rate, we cut all of our gradient times in order to preserve the same gradient volume between those two different methods with the two different flow rates. So with the 3 micron column, you can see that increasing the flow rate from 1.5 mils per minute to 3 mils per minute resulted in average resolution losses of about 17%. And there was actually a loss of resolution in every case. this is pretty consistent with what we might expect based on the column efficiency differences at those two flow rates. So if you're thinking of the Van Deemter curve, as we run faster, we're operating more out in that C-term region, and we're losing a little bit of efficiency. And so with a loss of efficiency, we expect a loss of resolution as well. And it's actually a very similar situation with the 1.6 micron particles. So increasing the flow rate resulted in resolution losses again in every case. And again, the average resolution loss was about 17%. So once again, we see some evidence of how the 1.6 micron column shows a little bit of efficiency loss after being used, again, for about 150 injections between all of these comparisons. But in this case, it actually still is outperforming the 3 micron particle at the faster flow rates. So once again, this loss of performance is likely due to some shifting in the packed bed that occurs during those gradient runs at higher pressures. Now, seeing the disadvantage of using smaller particles at higher pressure, which is the eventual loss of efficiency if there is some compromised bed structure, an alternative to using sub-2 micron particles that do require those elevated pressures are to use something like 2.7 micron superficially porous particles. And so on the work I'm about to show, we compared results for Perkle type. This is the Welco type phase. So we compared results for a 25 centimeter long column packed with 5 micron fully porous particles, and also a 10 centimeter column that's packed with 2.7 micron superficially porous particles. So the interesting thing about this comparison, it might seem odd just based on those dimensions that I listed, but these two columns give us approximately the same overall plate counts, which is why we decided to compare these two columns. So here is just a summary of the percent change of some of those metrics, including retention, efficiency, and resolution values for over 30 separations that we performed in normal phase, reverse phase, and SFC modes of chromatography. So when moving from that 25 centimeter, 5 micron fully porous column to the 10 centimeter, 2.7 micron superficially porous column, the instrument parameters, including our mobile phase composition, our flow rates, we kept those the same in all of these comparisons. Now, in nearly all of the cases, you might notice that our retentions were about 30 to 40% lower with those superficially porous particles. So even though our total plate counts, our efficiencies, that N, were similar or higher with the superficially porous particles, our resolution might have actually been a bit lower because of that loss of retention. That loss of retention is largely due to the surface area differences between fully porous particles and superficially porous particles. So you can imagine that just the presence of a solid core in the middle of the particle gives you a loss of available surface area inside the particle. But it is possible to compensate for that surface area difference by just weakening the mobile phase a little bit in many cases. So that is what I'm demonstrating here in this SFC separation of ketorolac. So if we start at the upper left-hand side of the slide, we see the separation performed on the 5 micron fully porous particle. The K prime for peak 2 is about 5.0. If we just port those same conditions over to the 10 centimeter long column packed with 2.7 micron superficially porous particles, that retention factor of peak 2 drops from about 5 to 2.8. And there is a slight loss of resolution there from about 2.9 to 2.7. But if we weaken the mobile phase just a little bit by reducing the amount of alcohol modifier, we can restore that retention and improve the resolution as well, while still, by moving to the smaller column, or the shorter column, excuse me, in this case, we're still reducing our analysis time quite significantly. We could show several cases where that simple adjustment to mobile phase strength compensates for that loss of retention due to the surface area differences. But there are actually a few cases where it doesn't work quite so nicely. So in the bottom of the slide, you can see an SFC separation where you can see that the retention, we're able to restore it by this simple weakening of mobile phase, but we actually don't restore the resolution that was lost. So with that, the kinetic advantages of superficially porous particles are pretty well known in the chromatography field. They've been available commercially for between 10 and 15 years now. That is particularly true in the achiral space, but they are gaining some traction in the chiral space as well. So as demonstrated here, they're obviously useful for enantiomer separations as well. And although the chiral stationary phases that are available with superficially porous particles are somewhat limited at this time, they are clearly useful for accelerating methods, accelerated method development, and also for maintaining high efficiencies in chiral screenings. So with that, thank you. And I think we can pass it along to the next speaker at this point.